Hey guys, today I will be talking about the 1968 art house science fiction film Barbarella. It was directed by French New Wave director Roger Vadim and is originally based on a French comic series of the same name. Take note of French being a running theme here, we'll address that later. Barbarella tackles the themes of sexuality, war and peace, power, and good versus evil, all interwoven with the erotic, macabre, and avant garde. On the cusp of the cultural revolution of the 70s, Barbarella has its fair share of groovy and psychedelic dreamscapes as well. As a first time viewer of all this, in short, it was just a pretty good time. It takes place in the future where all entities in the universe are at peace with one another. War and weapons are things of the past, and most human needs and desires have been compressed and boiled down to pills and technology. Barbarella is a space traveler from Earth who is assigned a mission to find a rogue scientist plotting to use force to destroy humanity. In a Wizard of Oz type of fashion, she meets people along the way, such as her blind angel friend Pygar, and ultimately ends up at the Emerald City, or in this case, it's called Sogo, a shortening of the biblical cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. After famous bombshells Brigitte Bardot, Sophia Loren, and Raquel Welch turned the role down, the titular role went to Roger Vadim's own wife at the time, someone you may know as Jane Fonda. Jane had moved to France to star in New Wave films, trying to break out of the girl next door trope she was accustomed to acting in America. In her documentary, Jane Fonda, in 5 acts, she goes on record to say Roger Vadim was seductive and charming, and says they lived a pretty hedonistic life while they were together. Perhaps their personal life contributed to how risque this film ultimately was, or maybe it was the Frenchness of it all. It was made in collaboration between a French production company and Paramount Pictures. To put into context, the French New Wave movement took form in the 50s and 60s, making Barbarella a contemporary with the late half of it. It was a new kind of cinema that was very self-aware and pushed the boundaries of mainstream filmmaking, exploring existentialism, emphasizing realism, and engaging in the social and political issues of the day. These are all things that can likewise be said about art house cinema, what we're talking about this week. Art house sci-fi films use science fiction to explore existential and or political questions that were implicit in some of the films of the 1950s. Contrary to what you might think, these sci-fi films still relied on realism to convey their messages. As seen in 2001 with Pan Am and just recognizable imagery, real locations are mixed with futuristic ones to create a recognizable environment. In Barbarella's case, the realistic environments are that of underground nightclubs, hookah lounges, and places for misfits of society to seek refuge. Maybe this isn't places that are recognizable to all of us, but nevertheless, they exist in this world. Now, you can't talk about Barbarella without talking about sex. This movie is provocative. It was in the 60s and it still is today. The innuendo is almost unparalleled, and there are scenes that I still wouldn't watch with my parents. Starting the movie with the groovy space striptease sets the tone right away. This movie is going to be suggestive, is what it's saying. By the end of the movie, Fonda faces death while in an excessive pleasure machine, and no, I am not making that up. Critics of the film argue that all this sex, whether implicit or explicit, was superfluous and overly sexualized her. Fonda defends this by discussing how her first priority for Barbarella was to actually keep her innocent. The character is not a vamp, and her sexuality is not measured by the rules of our society, Fonda says. She is not being promiscuous, but she follows the natural reaction of another type of upbringing. She's not a so-called sexually liberated woman either. That would mean rebellion against something. She's just different. She was born free. The aesthetics of this film are also just unmatched. From the colors, the sets, the ornamentation of everything, and especially Barbarella's iconic wardrobe. From a post-intercourse skunk costume we saw in an earlier slide, to plastic breast covers, to space disco fantasies, she wears it all. Costume designer Jacques Fontouré says he was inspired by the ideas of fashion designer Paco Rabanne, famous for his medieval meets samurai armor type of dresses. The movie is backed by elaborate scores and classic 60s pop-style songs. Composers Bob Crewe and Charles Fox even wrote new music and lyrics just for the film, as heard right here. And honestly, that song still holds up. Now on to its reviews. During its initial release, it didn't receive rave reviews, particularly in the US, which is just more conservative than the European crowd. One critic wrote that Vadim spent more time on the art direction, the costuming, and the psychedelic music track than the plot. Now, this is actually on par for art house sci fi, as the narrative isn't necessarily what's driving the film forward. It's the visuals themselves that work to emphasize a certain poetic beauty. Like other sci fi classics, Vadim wants an interaction with the audience. He wants them to think, fill in the blanks, and to contextualize for themselves some of the larger themes of the movie without being told directly what they were. Again, in Barbarella's case, these themes are overarchingly good versus evil, just war versus peace, lots of binary issues that humans can think about for themselves. And contemporary academic dialogue still argues that it doesn't do feminism many favors, as Barbarella is so eager to please whoever man is in front of her. But on the other end, a lot of people argue that it is a sex positive film in a time where those were far and few. This film, like other art house sci fi films, works to understand what it means to be human in a scientifically and technologically determined world. It shows us what it looks like if there was world peace, and by taking us out of our comfort zone, emphasizes the most carnal parts of the human experience. Its legacy lives on as it's considered a cult classic. And fun fact, the iconic band Duran Duran of the 80s took their name from the villain of this movie who goes by Durand Durand with a D at the end. One of my favorite bands, the Arctic Monkeys, also name drops Barbarella in their song Arabella. So it's nice to actually know where that comes from. This movie can be found on Amazon Prime for free streaming if you subscribe to their service, and honestly, I would recommend it. For anything, it's just a really pretty film to watch and absorb, and not to mention, you can see Queen Jane Fonda do her thing back in the 60s, and yeah, I'm jealous of anyone that gets to watch this for the first time. Thanks for listening.